Saturday, July 4th, 1863. Pennsylvania, USA. The tattered remnants of the Confederate Army begin their long, dejecting retreat towards Maryland, on their way back into their home territory. The perceived invincibility and infallibility of their commander had been utterly smashed by the victorious Union forces the previous day, and now, although they didn't know it yet, the Confederacy was on its long and inevitable road to ultimate defeat and surrender. Today, Descent into Darkness explores what many consider to be the turning point of the American Civil War in the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee's last great gamble. Background. Whilst I absolutely want to explore the causes and build-up to the very start of the American Civil War, I feel it perhaps should be saved for another day. But the very short answer is, of course, slavery. The expansion of the Union was split between the desires of the northern states to have no new slave states added, and the southern states wanting equal numbers of slave and free states to avoid the free states constantly outvoting them in Congress. Of course, there is much more to it than that, but again, another day. The man most associated with the Confederate Army is undoubtedly General Robert Edward Lee. Born on July 19, 1807, on a plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Lee had begun his military career at the prestigious West Point Officer Training Academy in 1825, and had begun his service as an engineer responsible for things such as entrenching, mining, and road building. He served during the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848, where he distinguished himself as one of General Winfield Scott's aides during the march from Veracruz to Mexico City. He displayed a great knack in surveying the enemy positions and finding routes of attack thought by the Mexicans to be impassable. By the end of the conflict, Lee had been promoted from captain all the way up to full colonel. However, this was only a brevet rank, meaning that whilst he had the authority and responsibilities of a colonel, his promotion was yet to be ratified, and thus, officially speaking, was still only a captain. In 1852, Lee, his promotion still not yet confirmed, was invited to become the superintendent at West Point. He was a little reluctant at first, but he was kind of forced into accepting the position. He spent 3 years in charge of West Point and made great improvements in the buildings and facilities. He would also encounter many of his future colleagues and enemies, giving them their military education in the process. He was able to get away from West Point in 1855 when his promotion to colonel was fully confirmed, and Lee was made second in command of the 16th Cavalry Regiment in Texas, tasked with protecting settlers from attacks from the Comanche and Apache. In the October of 1859, the fervent abolitionist John Brown, along with a further 21 like-minded men, had attempted to incite an armed insurrection of slaves by raiding the federal armory at Harpers, Ferry, Virginia. Brown's men had managed to get into the armory with relative ease and then barricaded themselves in the building. This act of sedition could not go unchallenged, and later that evening the armory was quickly surrounded by federal troops, who stormed the building. Within only 3 minutes, it was all over. Brown and his men were captured and imprisoned. Robert Lee was the man in command of the government forces. He would remain at Harper's Ferry until just after John Brown was convicted and hanged for his crimes in Charlestown. Many have pondered on Lee's opinion on slavery, but the man himself provided the answer in a letter to his wife, Mary, in 1856, saying that he felt it was up to God to decide the future course of slavery. He wrote, "In this enlightened age there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong with the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful Providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. This influence, though slow, is sure. The doctrines and miracles of our Saviour have required nearly 2,000 years to convert but a small part of the human race, and even among Christian nations what gross errors still exist. Whilst we see the course of the final abolition of human slavery is onward, and we give it the aid of our prayers and all justifiable means in our power, we must leave the progress as well as the result in His hands, who sees the end, who chooses to work by slow influences, and with whom 2,000 years are but a single day. Although the abolitionist must know this, and must see that he has neither the right nor the power of operating except by moral means and suasion, and if he means well to the slave, he must not create angry feelings in the master. That although he may not approve the mode which it pleases Providence to accomplish its purposes, the result will nevertheless be the same. That the reason he gives for interference in what he has no concern holds good for every kind of interference with our neighbours when we disapprove their conduct. Still, I fear he will persevere in his evil course. It is not strange that the descendants of those Pilgrim Fathers who crossed the Atlantic to preserve their own freedom of opinion have always proved themselves intolerant of the spiritual liberty of others. In a letter that Lee wrote in January of 1861, with the prospect of civil war looming, he wrote, "I can anticipate no greater calamity to the country than a dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing to sacrifice anything but honor for its preservation." Upon the outbreak of the Civil War, Lee was offered the chance to take command of the Union Army, but he, like many Southrons, felt a stronger bond to their individual states. Lee refused the offer and instead accepted the offer of the state of Virginia to lead their rapidly assembling forces. Lee set up a huge training ground on the outskirts of Richmond and set about constantly drilling the new recruits. He also put his engineering skills to use, as he spent an inordinate amount of time building a massive series of defensive earthworks in case the city were attacked. He was greatly ridiculed for this at the time, as the public felt that he was not being as aggressive as they would like. This earned him the scornful nicknames of Granny and the King of Spades. He was not appointed to a proper command until the June of 1862, whereupon he was made the general in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia. He would remain so right till the end of the war. Whilst Lee remained somewhat cautious, whenever he was presented with a clear opportunity, he never hesitated to strike. He was not afraid to break well-established rules of thumb, such as never dividing one's forces. He had done this on several occasions, usually leaving the other half in charge of the highly aggressive yet greatly eccentric and pious General Thomas Jackson, known to his men as Stonewall, due to his resolute and stoic character during the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas to Southerners. In this way, Lee had seen off many opposing Union generals, such as George McClellan, John Pope, McClellan again, Ambrose Burnside, and Joseph Hooker. Poor old Abe Lincoln was pulling his hair out trying to find someone who was capable of defeating Lee. The Southern Army had invaded the North in September of 1862 via the Shenandoah Valley, which had led to a 16-day campaign resulting in the Battle of Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg. This battle had been a Union victory. However, General McClellan had failed to pursue Lee's army, as he truly believed that he was facing a far greater force than he actually did. This was in no small part thanks to his intelligence chief, Allan Pinkerton, who greatly exaggerated the numbers by counting all camp followers as combatants, and then adding even more just for shits and giggles, which he then fed to McClellan, who, through fear of these shadows, had exercised extreme caution. Skipping ahead somewhat, following the resounding success that had been the Battle of Chancellorsville over April 30th to May 6th of 1863, Lee was convinced that another invasion of the North would not only succeed, but would show that the South were more than capable of waging an offensive campaign, which could potentially coax the French and the British into backing the South. In truth, Britain and France had no intentions whatsoever of getting involved in the conflict, but that didn't stop the South from trying. But instead of striking directly towards the obvious target of Washington, D.C., Lee instead decided that he would circle round far to the north of the northern capital, through Maryland and Pennsylvania. If this attack was successful, D.C. would be cut off from the rest of the Union. Following the Battle of Chancellorsville, both forces had met again at Brandy Station in Virginia on June 9th. Following this engagement, Lee had divided his forces, with the left column crossing into the Shenandoah Valley via the Manassas Gap, and the right column crossed at both Ashby's and Snickers Gap, passing to the west of Harpers Ferry, with both forces then making a beeline for Hagerstown, Maryland. Once at Hagerstown, the army then headed north towards Chambersburg, where they split again, with one half heading northeast towards the Pennsylvania state capital of Harrisburg, while the other headed east, most likely intending to reach Baltimore, as this was a major railroad hub. In the meantime, the Union Army had instead headed towards Centreville before clashing with the Confederate cavalry at Aldie and Middleburg, after then splitting in three and converging in the town of Frederick in Maryland. In the meantime, President Lincoln had sacked the indecisive Joe Hooker, who had been caught completely flat-footed at Chancellorsville, and selected George Meade as commander on the 28th of June 1863, the same day that the army had arrived in Frederick. Now the Northerners split into four to advance on a wide front. The two right-hand forces chased away rebel cavalry from the towns of Union Mills and Manchester, before clashing with them again over the border in Pennsylvania at Hanover, whilst the left two headed north. As the advance scouting parties of both sides unknowingly closed in on each other, the two armies would meet at a crossroads at a small Pennsylvania town that would soon be remembered forever in the American psyche: Gettysburg. Opposing forces. Whilst the Confederate army was always smaller and kept together on a shoestring with a motley collection of equipment and weaponry, they had still managed to win many engagements. Of course, it had helped that they were filled with the resolve of fighting for their own homes and families, which will always stiffen a fighter's determination. The Union soldiers were far better equipped and supplied. The entirety of the North's industrial might was brought to bear against their foes, and it showed in spades. Southern soldiers couldn't even get hold of decent coffee, having to make do with a weird and disgusting-sounding concoction of chicory and roasted peanuts. And if you're anything like me, you will know that coffee is life, so to not have this comforting and invigorating pick-me-up must have been truly hell on earth. The Union soldiers were much more uniformly dressed, too, the obvious image being of the dark blue tunics and slouch hats. The rebels, on the other hand, were dressed in a much more haphazard way. The official colour was grey, but it was found that butternut brown was much cheaper to make, and so there would be a mixture of these colours. By far the most absurdly dressed regiments on both sides were modelled on a trend from Europe, and wore bright red baggy pantaloons and red hats with tassels hanging from them. These units were known as Zouaves. General Lee had a force of around 75,000 infantry, 270 artillery pieces of various type and calibre, and around 9,500 cavalry. Following the devastating loss of Stonewall Jackson, who was accidentally shot by his own men during the Battle of Chancellorsville and died a few days later after having his right arm amputated, but then caught pneumonia, Lee reorganized his army from 2 infantry corps to 3. The first was commanded by Lieutenant General James Longstreet. The second corps was commanded by Lieutenant General Richard Ewell, and the third by Lieutenant General A.P. Hill. However, the cavalry under the command of John Ewell Brown, or J.E.B., or Jeb Stuart, and his 7 brigades tended to operate entirely separately from the army, often going off of their own accord on missions that were not necessarily in line with the army's requirements. This could prove highly problematic as the cavalry of that time served a dual role, the obvious being in the offensive as fast-moving shock troops, but their other function was to act as the army's eyes and ears, gathering intelligence of the enemy's disposition. In such a conflict, good intelligence was king. Sadly for Lee, at Gettysburg, Jeb Stuart had decided to not remain close to the infantry and had disappeared off on their own little jolly on entirely the other side of the Union army, where he shadowed their movements and harassed them in several small lightning-fast skirmishes. This left Lee virtually blind except for what he could see from where he was at any given time. This greatly hampered not only his planning, but slowed his ability to react to a threat. This would prove crucial in the battle to come. General George Meade, on the other hand, could call upon between 90 to 100,000 men, 360 field guns, and a staggering 36 regiments of cavalry. Meade had no such problems with keeping control of his horsemen, but the terrain of the battlefield would render them somewhat impotent after the first day of engagement. Meade's infantry was organised into 7 corps, although the numbering was a little scattered. The 1st Corps under Major General John Reynolds, 2nd Corps under Major General Winfield Hancock, 3rd Corps under Major General Daniel Sickles, 5th Corps commanded by Major General George Sykes, 6th Corps commanded by Major General John Sedgwick, 11th Corps commanded by Major General Oliver Howard, and 12th Corps under the command of Major General Henry Slocum. The cavalry units on both sides tended to be armed with a wide array of weaponry such as sabres, revolvers, carbines, and even double-barreled shotguns. The Southerners armed themselves with whatever they could get hold of, but the Union horsemen had much better access to the very latest technology in the form of breech-loading and repeating arms, mostly provided in bulk private purchases by the commanding officers. Most of both sides' infantry were armed with some sort of variant of the percussion-lock rifled musket, the most common being either the British-made Enfield model of 1853 and the US-made Springfield model of 1861. The major differences of these two guns are purely cosmetic, although I happen to prefer the look of the Springfield personally. Both were of a nominal .58 caliber and fired the elongated hollow-base projectiles originally designed by Frenchman Claude Minier, but his name would be slightly bastardized and the bullets would become known as the mini-ball. This projectile caused some horrific injuries, tending to tumble through soft tissue and shatter bone. A hit in the limb would almost certainly mean an amputation. Many photographs were taken of the thousands of unfortunate souls that were permanently invalided after taking a hit from a mini-ball. What was made worse was that the rifled musket was far more accurate than anything had ever gone before, more than capable of hitting targets at 500 yards, and yet the majority of shooting was conducted at far less than that, sometimes as low as 50 yards. This meant that the number of battlefield injuries was significantly higher. It is interesting to see modern accurate weapons being paired with Napoleonic tactics that dictated closing with the enemy as much as one's nerve held before unleashing a brief exchange of volley fire and then pressing forward with a bayonet charge. It is little wonder, then, that the American Civil War is still the bloodiest war in US history. The Battle of Gettysburg. Day 1, July 1st, 1863. With reports coming in of sightings of large portions of the Confederate vanguard in the early morning, Cavalry Brigadier General John Buford decided to place his men across 3 ridges to the west of Gettysburg town, anchored on McPherson's Ridge. His men had dismounted and drew their carbines, shortened versions of infantry long arms, much more suited to horseback. Buford knew that he could not hope to halt the rebel advance, but he could at least fight a running delayed action that could slow them down long enough to allow the main Union force to come up in support, which was still a little ways off at this point. By placing his men where he did, Buford was able to screen and block the way toward the much more advantageous higher ground on the south of the town, on Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. He knew that he had to do whatever he could to deny this vital position to the enemy. When the leading divisions of the Southern Army had arrived and formed up, Buford's positions were assaulted by elements of A.P. Hill's corps in the west. The first to engage were men of Southern General Heth's brigade at 0730, who advanced in columns along the Chambersburg Pike. When they spotted the dismounted Union cavalry, they deployed into line. Legend has it that the first shot of the battle was fired by Union man Lieutenant Marcellus Jones. The 2 brigades were a far greater force than the Northerners could handle, but still put up a stiff resistance, as they had something of an ace in the hole. They were armed with much more up-to-date breech-loading carbines made by the Sharps Company. These lighter, handier, and more importantly, significantly faster-firing weapons checked the Confederate advance, but by 10:20 the Union men had been pushed off McPherson's Ridge. However, it was at this point that the vanguard of Major General Reynolds' 1st Corps had arrived on the field and had begun to array their men. As the morning turned to afternoon, the 1st Brigade of Lieutenant General Ewell had arrived in the north of the town, but so had Major General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps, who had quickly occupied the ground west of the Rock Creek. The attack to the west ebbed and flowed as the day wore on, the dismounted Union cavalrymen giving as good as they got and inflicting hefty casualties. Sadly for the North, Major General Reynolds was shot and killed whilst attempting to marshal his men and artillery pieces into position in a stand of trees known as Herbst Woods, meaning that command of the 1st Corps now fell to Major General Abner Doubleday. The fighting around the west of the town continued until around 12:30, at which both sides stopped and regrouped. 2 hours later, fighting resumed, but now the entirety of Heth's division pushed forward, with men of the North Carolina Brigade turning the flank, forcing them to withdraw, but the North Carolinians took heavy casualties for their success. Eventually the weight of numbers won out. The Northerners simply did not have enough men in the field yet to hold off the rebels, who had begun to push towards the gap between the two Union infantry corps, and the 11th were still in the process of deploying. Therefore, Doubleday had little choice but to throw his reserves into the gap to help shore up the line. At around 1400, Ewell's men had begun to mount an assault on Howard's position, with 2 divisions that were able to overlap and outflank the northern line, made even easier by a severe blunder on the part of Howard's men. Northern Brigadier General Francis Barlow had thought to take the high ground of Blocher's Knoll, but this left his men exposed to attack from multiple sides, known in military terms as a salient. Barlow's entire division were quickly overrun, with the man himself being wounded and captured. This was a catastrophic blow for Major General Howard, as his right flank was now completely turned. If he did nothing, he risked his entire corps being wiped out, and so he did the only thing he could do. He ordered his men to withdraw. In the west, Doubleday's men were forced back toward Seminary Ridge, not to be confused with Cemetery Ridge or Hill, which will play a part later. Southern General A.P. Hill decided to add Pender's division to the right of the assault, which led to the order being given by the Northerners to retreat back through the town of Gettysburg itself. Both sets of men from the west and the north headed south toward the high ground at Cemetery Hill, just as Buford had predicted at the beginning of the day. By this time, Major General Hancock's 2nd Corps had arrived and taken up position on Cemetery Hill, and provided cover to the retreating 1st and 11th Corps. Hancock, as the senior man, took over command of the forces until George Meade could arrive. He surveyed the position on which they found themselves, a high, gentle slope with a commanding view all about. He remarked to his subordinates, "I think this is the strongest position by nature upon which to fight a battle that I ever saw. Very well, sir, I select this as the battlefield." But now it was the rebels who blundered. General Lee had arrived with his staff and had immediately seen the problem that such a position would pose to him if they were allowed to strengthen it. He hurriedly dispatched a message to General Ewell, ordering him to take the ridge if practicable. However, Ewell, for whatever reason, determined that such an attack was not practicable, and so did not try. Had he done so at this early stage and had been able to chase off the already running Northern army off the hill, it is highly likely that the Battle of Gettysburg could have had a very different outcome. As the rest of the afternoon turned into evening, both forces continued to swell in numbers and jockeyed for position opposite their respective number. Day 2, July 2nd. By the second day, the opposing forces were settled in their positions. The Union army had wisely managed to occupy the high ground that formed a fishhook shape anchored on Cemetery Ridge to the south of the town. General Lee could only go on assumptions of his opponent's positions, and so he planned an assault on Culp's Hill to the northeast, whilst a massive assault swept around from the right flank, anchored on the hills known as Round Top and Little Round Top. However, the Union line extended far further south than Lee had thought, and thus had occupied the entirety of Cemetery Ridge. Finally, Jeb Stuart's cavalry had decided to grace everyone with his presence, arriving at General Lee's headquarters at around noon, but played no further part in the action on the second day. Another severe blunder nearly spelled utter disaster for the Union when the commander of the 3rd Corps, the foolish and arrogant Major General Daniel Sickles, on the far left of the Union line, annoyed at the lack of a decent view of the enemy, ordered his men off the heavily wooded high ground of Cemetery Ridge and a few hundred yards forward into a nearby peach orchard and wheat field. General Meade had ridden out to Sickles' new position and demanded to know just what the hell he was playing at by defying his orders. At 1500, the Confederate artillery began bombarding Sickles' men. Sickles requested permission from Meade to withdraw, as he now realized his line was stretched far too thinly, but Meade refused, knowing that an attack was imminent. If they withdrew now, it could quickly turn into a rout. The Southerners of General Longstreet's corps had seen the opposing Union position and immediately exploited it, bursting out from the tree line and attacking Sickles' now isolated unit. The rebels swarmed the peach orchard, uttering their war cry, the dreaded rebel yell. And began to surge forward toward the two hills, but a timely intervention by Meade, who had ordered George Sykes's 5th Corps to move up from the rear, and smashed into John Bell Hood's brigade on the Confederate right flank of the slopes of the hills, blunting the attack momentum and saving Sickles' men from being completely encircled and overrun. So fierce was the fighting at the foot of Little Round Top that this area has become known as the Devil's Den. The hero of the second day was undoubtedly Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine, who, whilst part of the force defending Little Round Top, saw an opportunity to strike the rebels on their right flank. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and form line. Then, in a textbook move, his men charged down the hill in a swift right-sweeping motion like a closing gate, and smashed into the exposed flank of the Confederates, who completely capitulated at the suddenness of the attack and beat a hasty retreat, chased by whizzing bullets around their heads. This, one of the most famous phases of the whole battle, certainly didn't do Chamberlain's reputation any harm. Despite the bolstering by the 5th Corps, Daniel Sickles' command was virtually wiped out as a fighting force. Sickles himself had been wounded by a cannonball which had smashed into his lower right leg, and he had to have the limb amputated. Amazingly, if somewhat macabrely, the remnants of the bones of Daniel Sickles' leg have been preserved and are on display at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, a tangible link to the man and the battle itself. On the left flank of the Confederate army, Ewell had been ordered to assault Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill to dislodge the forces at their summit in a bid to turn the Union right. From 1600, Ewell had subjected the hills to a bombardment from his 32 guns and General A.P. Hill's further 55 pieces. However, this proved ineffective. The Union defenders had been stripped of around 3/4 of its force to defend against Longstreet's attack on the other side of the field. This left only a single brigade from New York State, from Major General Slocum's 12th Corps, to defend Culp's Hill. The New Yorkers had dug in and constructed makeshift earthworks using shallow trenches and foxholes breasted with felled logs that men hid behind, which then helped as a shield from small arms fire when the infantry came on. When the rebels attacked at 1800, the northern soldiers were forced to abandon some of the lower defences on the hill and withdraw to the higher defensive lines. Only 3 of the 4 Confederate brigades of Johnson's division were able to assault Culp's Hill, as they had to cross the Rock Creek, which had only a small number of crossing places, and thus caused significant delays in the attack. Meanwhile, on Cemetery Hill, General Jubal Early's division had begun to assault, attempting to hook around the right flank between the 2 peaks. Early's men made significant progress and even managed to reach the crest of the hill, getting in amongst the defensive works and capturing a couple of batteries of artillery. Unfortunately for the rebels, Early realized that his attack had no support from elsewhere, which opened his men up to a counter that could easily overwhelm them. Major General Robert Rhodes's division had begun to approach the foot of the hill, but due to a lack of preparedness, they had to cover a significant distance before they even reached the area of the field. Reluctantly, Early ordered the withdrawal from the hill, rendering their efforts completely pointless. 3 miles to the northeast of Gettysburg, a minor cavalry skirmish occurred when Southern brigades under Brigadier General Wade Hampton clashed with the Union horsemen under a certain Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer. I'm sure we shall be looking into his military career in a future video. Day 3, July 3rd. By the dawning of the 3rd day of the battle, General Lee had the Union army half surrounded on the hills. He decided to renew the attack along similar lines as the previous day, engaging both flanks. Before his orders could be sent out that morning, The Union took the initiative and began to pound the rebel positions on the lower slope of Culp's Hill, followed by a push by the remnants of Slocum's defenders. They were able to dislodge the Confederates and were left in command of the whole of Culp's Hill once more by 1100. Lee's attacks had thus far been in the flanks, but he was now convinced that due to these attacks Meade had been forced to weaken his centre. He had convinced himself that if he were to attack the Union centre now, the whole line would break and he would carry the day and the victory. He therefore ordered every available cannon to commence a huge bombardment of Cemetery Ridge. This would be a fierce and heavy that would, Lee hoped, destroy the Union big guns and cause horrific casualties amongst the infantry. However, Meade had taken a page out of the Duke of Wellington's handbook against Napoleon's forces, keeping his men on the reverse side of the slope and ordering them to lie down. This meant the solid shot and shrapnel shells would simply fly harmlessly over their heads. Beginning at 1300, the largest ever artillery barrage on American soil from 170 guns was now raining down around the heights of Gettysburg. The Union guns did attempt some counter-battery fire, but this slowly slackened as the rebel barrage wore on. When the Union guns had fallen silent, General Lee turned to his second-in-command, General James Longstreet, to give the order to charge. However, Longstreet could see the folly of this attack and greatly feared that his men were about to be fed into a gigantic meat grinder. He headed over towards General George Pickett's division, but he could not bring himself to give the order. After an awkward, silent pause, Pickett asked Longstreet if he was to attack. Longstreet could only muster a resigned, single nod of the head. At around 1500, Pickett's men began to pour out of the tree line, and so began the most disastrous and crucial point of the battle. Although this phase of the battle is commonly known today as Pickett's Charge, it was heavily bolstered on the left by A.P. Hill's corps, a total of around 10,000 to 12,000 men. The men of Pickett's Charge had to cross over 3/4 of a mile of completely open terrain before they could get to Cemetery Ridge. It was then that the Union guns suddenly roared back into life, having been ordered to cease fire to draw Lee into showing his hand. Lee had taken the bait, and now Pickett's men were to suffer for it. The Union poured down a deadly hail of exploding shell and solid round shot at the advancing Graham-Brown line, which left a trail of bloodied broken bodies behind it. When they got close enough, the Union guns switched to firing canister shot, a thin-walled tin can filled with 1-ounce lead balls that burst apart at the muzzle like a gigantic shotgun. This caused even more devastating injuries, and, as the rebels crested the hill, they were met with a withering rifle fire from the infantry. Despite this, the rebels were able to gain ground, pushing hard against the Union lines, which did begin to falter in places. At a place known as the Angle, the line did break, and the Northerners ran, but Meade was quick to order reserves to be brought up to plug the gap. The summit of the ridgeline quickly dissolved into bitter hand-to-hand fighting. Swords, bayonets, and even bare hands clashed in a bloody melee. The Angle has since become known as the high watermark of the Confederacy, for they were unable to advance any further. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead ordered his men to turn to captured Union guns on their erstwhile owners, but quickly found that there was no ammunition left in the caisson. The Union forces were simply too much. The rebels, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, began to sound the call to retreat. The remnants of the 3 divisions poured back down the slope of Cemetery Hill toward their starting lines. Around half of the men who began the charge did not make it back. As he walked back to the tree line where they had started from, a dejected and shell-shocked General Pickett was hailed by General Lee, who asked him to reform his division and attack again. According to legend, Pickett looked up to his commander, fighting back the tears for his lost men, and replied, "General Lee, I have no division." The penny finally dropped for Lee. His force was spent, and he was defeated, and all he had to show for it was a field littered with tens of thousands of bodies, men and horses, dead and injured. The dead quickly beginning to rot and swell in the baking heat of the summer sun, flies and crows descending in hordes to feast on the abundance of flesh. One famous photograph captured at the aftermath of the battle shows many bodies laying strewn all about. This photograph has become known by the nickname the Harvest of Death, but this was only one small snapshot of the entire hellish scene. Aftermath. The very next morning, on July 4th, General Lee ordered the retreat. He decided to cut back through Maryland and cross into West Virginia at Falling Waters on the Potomac River. He would never step foot on Northern soil in anger again. When the butcher's bill was tallied up, the Union forces had lost a little over 23,000 men killed and injured. However, the Confederate army had lost somewhere between 23 and 28,000 men, a far greater proportion of the forces Lee fielded, and numbers that he simply could not replace. George Meade had won himself a decisive victory, and now, unlike his predecessors, he would not let the Confederates leave unmolested. He made sure to pursue and harry the retreating enemy. The two armies would fight several small skirmish and rearguard actions on their way back into the Confederate States. For his gallantry in the battle and his devastating bayonet charge, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain would be awarded the Medal of Honor. He would also go on to be Governor of Maine between 1867 and 71. A truly fascinating gentleman. The war would drag on for another 2 more years, but the Union would be on the offensive from that moment on. Lee no longer had the numbers to conduct an offensive campaign, and so was forced to fight a multitude of defensive actions. Legacy. The Battle of Gettysburg did not decide the American Civil War in the same way as, say, Waterloo had in 1815. There are many that see Gettysburg as the turning point in which the war finally started to go right for the Union. However, I would argue that it was the fall of the city of Vicksburg on the same day that Lee ordered his retreat was a much greater victory. This split the Confederacy in two and made the South's ability to wage war even more difficult than it already was. But Gettysburg was a tumultuous battle that would become the bloodiest of the entire Civil War. Such a great loss of American lives will forever preserve it in the minds of the people as the most important engagement of the conflict. The utter waste of lives that was Pickett's charge shows that General Lee had begun to believe his own legend of infallibility. Only a delusional man could have ordered such a suicidal attack. Pickett certainly never forgave Lee for the decimation of his division. However, we must not forget that Lee was essentially fighting blind thanks to the absence of Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. The presence of this vital wing of his forces could well have given Lee a much clearer picture of what he was actually up against. The rebels were, on average, much better shooters than their counterparts due to their mostly countryside upbringing compared to the largely city origins of the Union men, and, as Voltaire once said, Dieu n'est pas les gros bataillons, mais pour ceux qui tirent le mieux. God is not on the side of the big battalions, but of the best shots. It had been this factor, coupled to Lee's superior tactical mind, that had carried old Johnny Reb to victory so many times before over Billy Yank. However, the North had the far greater numbers and the greater resources, which, as we saw in the Second World War, will always win out. But I feel that it is not hyperbole to say that Gettysburg was the battle that saved the Union, and by extension the very soul of the USA. It was the victory that the public of the North needed after a string of defeats and missed opportunities. But what makes the battle such an horrific affair is the incredible casualty rate, a combined total of around 50,000, and what we must never forget is that all of the men killed were Americans. The whole Civil War would see around 600,000 killed, and although the North would come out as victor, and whilst it can be easily argued that the Northern cause was in the right, I cannot shake from my mind the feeling that, in one way, with so many lives so tragically cut short, all America lost. It is often cited that in the immediate aftermath of the defeat, Lee had opined, "It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it." However, this is actually attributed to him following the Battle of Fredericksburg the previous December. But regardless of when it was said, you must admit it is a highly poignant quote, and a lesson that we have sadly ignored in the years since. In the modern day, the battlefield at Gettysburg has been preserved by the federal government, and you can visit it today and imagine just what both sides found themselves up against. The battle has been immortalized on film in the 1993 movie Gettysburg, starring Martin Sheen as General Lee, Tom Berenger as General Longstreet, and Stephen Lang as General Pickett, and Jeff Daniels as Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. I cannot recommend this movie enough. A brilliant piece of cinema. 5 months after the battle, on November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln delivered a short but succinct speech to dedicate a new national cemetery to the dead. Despite Lincoln's many faults and in some cases outrages that could easily fill a whole video of its own, in these 272 words, I feel that Lincoln captured the very essence of what it means to be an American. The very foundational notion of liberty, equality, and justice for all, and paying great tribute to the men who gave their lives in the preservation of that ideal. And although it would not be another century until black Americans were finally legally recognized as equals, it was Abraham Lincoln who, despite his initial opposition to emancipation, was able to point the way forward and lead the charge for the eventual moral salvation of the nation. I can think of no better way to end this video than with my own rendition of those immortal words.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world may little note, nor long remember, what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to join the Dark Legion, the greatest fan base on YouTube. Check out my back catalogue to find other great videos just like this. I've covered other great battles before, so if you're just into the military stuff, I got you, dog. And don't worry, there will be more coming. Just in case any of my fellow Brits were seething that I used a few Americanisms in this video, that's because it's about American history, and that's how they say things, so I wanted to keep it authentic. But if you want to have a go at me about it in the comments, then go ahead if you really must. But don't worry, I'll be back to saying Lieutenant soon enough. What would you have done differently as either the North or the South? Let me know in the comments. I do love a good tactical discussion. And of course, what should I cover next? Put your devilishly dark suggestions in the comments and I will happily reply to as many of you as possible, as I believe that you, the audience, are the most important part of all of this. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description, and help me keep on bringing you this deep dive content to expand your minds. Or you can go by the Super Thanks button if you'd like to give a one-off donation. A huge thank you to all my current patrons, both old and new. You guys and gals really are the best. And if you simply cannot get enough of YouTube's foremost buttery-voiced narrator, head on over to my alternate channel DID Reads, linked below, to hear more. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.